if we were to look at the US-China relations, which dominates much of the discussion of international relations in terms of how we think maybe about great power rivalry, you argue that it's a wrong way to frame that as a repeat or rehash of what the US-Soviet relation is.
Fundamentally wrong, I think.
But there are still many people who kind of think of this as a new Cold War. Why are they wrong?
Well, they are wrong because they focus on the superficial rather than the essential. Look at how should I put it? The old Cold War, the US-Soviet Cold War, right? What was that? That was an existential struggle between two systems, two ways of organizing modern industrial society to see which was the better way. One organized around the market and a concept of democracy that placed emphasis on the individual. The other organized around the planned economy and a concept of democracy organized around the vanguard party that represents the people, right? Doesn't give them much rights, but it represents them. And their competition, this is existential in the sense that is your way better or my way better? There's no compromise, right? Well, we know the answer to that because the Soviet Union is no more. The US and China, by contrast, and the Soviet Union never played any major global role, except in the energy market and so on, right? By contrast, the US and China are both vital nodes in the international global economy, right? And they are connected to each other and the rest of us by a historically new phenomenon. And that phenomenon are supply chains of a depth, of a complexity, of a scope, of a density we have never before seen in world history. Now that makes a huge difference. It's going to be very difficult. Now, neither the US nor China are very comfortable with this interdependence because it does make them mutually vulnerable to each other. And they are trying to mitigate it, the US by trying to reorient supply chains either back to the US or to friendly countries, and by denying China certain technologies. China by trying to become more self-sufficient in certain technologies and trying to raise the role of domestic consumption in its GDP. But I don't think either is going to succeed, at least not to the extent that they hope. And if you look at this latest iteration of their trade war, both of them have been quietly exempting certain commodities from each other from tariffs, both China and the US. There will be separation of this system. It's a very dense web of supply chains, particularly at the high end, high-end semiconductors and so on. But I cannot imagine this whole thing bifurcating completely. And China, much as it wants to rely more on domestic consumption, has been trying actually for more than a decade. In fact, if I remember the dates correctly, 15, almost 20 years, with very limited success. I think they have been stalled out. Somewhere below 40% of their GDP is due to domestic consumption. An economy of that size should be 50% or more. But they have been sort of plateaued at under 40%. If I'm not mistaken, it's 39% for more than a decade. Why is that so? I mean, there are technical reasons for it, but I think the fundamental reason is there is a loss of confidence in the direction the current Chinese leadership under Xi Jinping is taking China. Loss of confidence, not just by foreigners, loss of confidence by the Chinese people. And the most productive part of Chinese people, the private sector. I think you know that many of private sector economies are trying to get the money out of China all over the place, including to Singapore, to Malaysia, to all over the place, right? That's a loss of confidence. And because they're not sure which direction their leadership is taking the country. Just give you one example. Chinese economy is not doing well. It's fluttering, right? The measures that they have put, try to kickstart the economy, haven't really worked to the extent that they want to. Because it's a political issue of confidence, not a technical economic issue that can be solved by technical solutions like more stimulus and things like that. So when was it? End of February, March, I think Xi Jinping called Jack Ma, who has been living in, because he got lost confidence, he was been living in, he was beaten up on the head a few years ago, and he was living in Japan. So they had a conference, they called Jack Ma back and other big private entrepreneurs to Beijing, and basically said, we need you, private sector, you please, go and do what you're supposed to do. And it's all very good, right? But the very next week, within a week, they had a Politburo meeting, also chaired by Xi Jinping, and was publicized. The main result of the Politburo meeting is we must put emphasis on party security. So you're sending a mixed message. On the one hand, private sector, you go ahead. The other hand, my main priority is party security. So if you're an entrepreneur, what would you think? You wouldn't know what to think. Which is the priority?
Yeah.
The answer is actually both. The trouble is they contradict each other. And this is not new, This is 2012, quite some time ago, at their 18th Party Congress, the Chinese Party, Communist Party, acknowledged in public that their growth model, which had great results in the 1990s and in fact for the first decade of the 2000s, was not sustainable. That growth model is basically a very heavy emphasis on infrastructure development, heavy infrastructure development, led by state-owned enterprise and basically financed by property sales, rather inflated property sales. But sooner or later, even in a very vast country like China, you run out of productive infrastructure to build. I mean, have you been to China?
Last year.
Okay, if you go around there, every small town has got an international airport.
Yeah.
There's a huge network of rails and all that. The question is, do you need all this? After a point, yes, you needed it.
Yeah.
But now I think it's gone to the point where the productivity return is slower than, the return on this investment is slower, and therefore there's a lot of debt building up, right? They know this, they're not silly about this whole thing, right?
Yeah.
So this is 2012. They acknowledge this is not sustainable in public. The next year, they rolled out a plan that promised a more decisive role for the market in allocating resources. In other words, more economic efficiency.
Yep.
Very little of that plan has been implemented. Why? Not because they're stupid, not because they're intransigent, because they do face a fundamental dilemma. Don't forget that China is a communist country. Not maybe in its ideology anymore, but in its political structure. It is run by a Leninist party. The Chinese Communist Party is modeled as a Leninist party. And the primary value of any Leninist party is control. Whereas more economic efficiency, by definition, means less control. If you want more market efficiency, you got to let go. It's not an absolute choice. You don't have to either let go completely or control everything. But what's the balance? They cannot find a new balance. Or they dare not find a new balance. And they've been struggling with that ever since. On top of that comes Mr. Trump imposing tariffs with gay abandon, right? So I don't think they are in a good situation. They're not going to collapse or anything like that. But there's something that adds to our uncertainties. Now, I don't think either the US or China are eager to fight, right? Whether through trade or anywhere. I was telling somebody the other day, I look at them as they are. They are like these two huge MMA wrestlers, fighters. They have paid their money to fight and gone into the ring. Because the payment to fight, the table money, if you put it that way, is I put tariffs on you, you put tariffs on me. So we go in the ring. And they're standing in the ring, shouting at each other, snarling at each other, making threatening gestures. But they're not really eager to rush at each other to come to grips because they know both are going to get hurt. And in the meantime, both are been quietly exempting some goods for each other from tariffs. They want to talk. because they know they must stop. But they don't know how to start that without looking weak, and they don't want to look weak. That's where we are.
Yeah.
Now, this is a long way to come to why this is not a new Cold War.
Yeah.
They are not eager to fight because they know both will get hurt. Why will both get hurt? Because they are bound to each other by this dense web of supply chains. So they are fighting, they are competing within a system. They are not competing, they are not two systems competing against each other to see which is the only survivor. So when you're all one system, you still can compete and can be fierce competition, but it's not about destroying the system. It's about dominating the system. It's about maintaining your dominance in the system, preventing your rival from challenging that too much. But it's not existential because it is not about replacing one system with another. And those dynamics are very fundamentally different from Cold War dynamics. Cold War dynamics is binary. It's you or it's me. Your system or mine. We know the answer to that. Because even China and the US, they are not a pure planned economy. They are not a pure capitalist economy. Both are what economists would call mixed economies, differing only in the proportion of the planned and the market elements. In the West, they like to call the planned elements the regulated elements. Comes to the same thing, like state intervention with the market, right? So I think this is a fundamentally different type of competition. It is not existential.